Welcome to Antitrust Code by Concurrences. Concurrences is the leading antitrust database, with over 30,000 articles on competition law. Concurrences is also the largest network of antitrust experts, with lawyers, economists, enforcers, and academics in 85 countries. By listening to this podcast, you will learn the fundamentals of competition law and hear about the latest antitrust news, thanks to our guests, the best experts in the antitrust world.
I'm delighted to be interviewing Olivier Guersent as part of this Concurrence podcast. We're here in Palo Alto at the Concurrence Antitrust Tech Conference, sponsored by Clifford Chance and Compass Lexecon. I'm an economist at Compass Lexecon. Olivier needs no introduction, but I will, in any case, introduce him and say that he's the DG at DG Comp for the last 5 years, and has been involved with DG Comp, I think, since 1992, so a few years after the EU merger regulation. Olivier has already participated in two panels this morning, one on digital regulation and the other on digital mergers, and we're going to focus in our discussion on digital mergers. And I've already very much enjoyed your insights this morning, and we're lucky to be able to record some of those now. So thank you very much for your participation today.
You're very welcome.
So when we come to digital mergers, I'd like to just start with some general questions about the substance of theories of harm, then move on to some slightly more specific questions about the mission letter and Draghi and the new guidelines, perhaps briefly touch on jurisdictional issues, and then pull back to some bigger picture issues to close with. So if we can start with the substance of theories of harm, and we discussed this a little bit earlier already today. Can you give us your sense of the extent to which the theories of harm in digital mergers are genuinely new and different to the theories of harm we've been sort of accustomed to in other types of mergers over the years? Or are they more just a kind of refashioning of those to the fact matrix, the fact pattern that comes with a tech merger?
Okay. By and large, when you look historically over the last, say, 10 years, on our track record in assessing tech mergers, you will find that is fairly traditional. I mean, what you see is, of course, you have more non-horizontal mergers than in more traditional sectors. Mm-hmm. And maybe non-horizontal mergers tend to display issues more often, mm-hmm, because of this ecosystem network effect, the specificities. But the theories themselves, at the end of the day, one is non-horizontal. It's about input foreclosure. It's about consumer foreclosure. It's about preventing rival to enter the market. It's about barriers to expansion. It's, mm-hmm, and nobody can say it's really new. Yeah. But the rate of occurrence is different, and also the context is different because of the network effects, because of this specificity that you have this market that are linked in ways that are not really vertical, not really horizontal. But it's not either a conglomerate effect, mm-hmm, as you would analyze in the traditional market.
Understood. Now, because it's not entirely new, does not necessarily imply that the toolkit and the analytical framework is sufficiently well developed. So what is your perspective on the analytical frameworks for this kind of problem? Do you think, from your point of view, it's sufficiently well developed to give a good guide for the agency to distinguish between the anti-competitive merger and the pro-competitive merger, and to provide reasonable predictability to parties? Or do you think there is still a lot of uncertainty?
Well, there as well you need to distinguish. I mean, I would say that for the majority of the mergers, I'm sure the parties had foreseen that it would be not necessarily a walk in the park. whenever they had to face close scrutiny. So in that sense, it doesn't come as a surprise. The analytical framework is well known, and I think we're well equipped. At least we developed it over the years for the last 15 years. At the same time, we're talking, at least for platform cases, which is not all of tech, but for platform cases, usually you're in multi-sided markets. And that, of course, the conjunction of network effect, multi-sided markets, and ecosystems, in my view, this is really what makes it more complex than traditional cases sometimes, because you may have fairly traditional negative effects in one market, and it's more blurred in another among the various markets that are impacted by the various sides of the same market. That was the case, for example, in Booking in Traveleye, in which you could debate about the balance of detrimental and positive effect for end consumers. All views are welcome. But certainly it was massively detrimental for hotel owners that have to rely on the platform. So that specificity also is important.
And do you balance between those two user groups, or an anti-competitive effect for either one is sufficient for a problem, irrespective of the benefits to the other?
In my view, that is one of the issues. This case is being considered by the court, and I would expect that this is one of the points that will be in focus.
Yes.
But that's very new. In theory, if you read the merger regulation, my take would be you don't balance.
Yeah.
It's enough that in one market you have the creation or the strengthening of dominance.
Yeah.
But of course, I mean, these activities are so complex and intricated that I don't know. My private view would be no, you should probably not balance.
Yep. That's an interesting issue. It's a small aside, but I do a lot of work on interchange fees, and the balance.
It's the same.
You get exactly the same. Sort of
no, exactly.
goal.
I spent 10 years in finance, and that's
same issue.
That's exactly the same issue. Yeah.
Okay, so if we get a little bit more specific beyond sort of the nature of the theories of harm, the mission letter to the new commissioner included a request or a proposal to update the horizontal merger guidelines.
Yes.
Can you just give us a flavor of what we should be expecting in that area?
I would say it is welcome, because anyway the horizontal merger guidelines were quite old. And as we just discussed, a lot has happened. So it's a bit like when we updated our guidance on the market definition. I mean, I had been involved with the drafting of the previous market definition notice, which was issued back in 1997.
Yeah.
So there was not a word about tech and these two multi-sided markets or anything of it, or non-price markets. So it badly needed a good refreshment. Well, to a lesser extent, the same goes with merger guidelines. I think, and we mandated to do this, so that will happen now pretty soon. I think, in the light of what we just discussed, one of the issues will need to be decided by Mrs. Ribera will be, do I simply go for a review and maybe a revision, probably a revision of the horizontal merger guideline, or do I take the opportunity to also revise the non-horizontal merger guidelines? Something she will have to decide. There are pros and cons.
Yeah.
If she would decide to do the two, then the next decision will be, should I have only one set of guidelines, or is it still relevant to have a distinct set of horizontal, non-horizontal?
Yeah.
Knowing that, in particular in tech, you will have a fair degree of interpenetration between the two.
Yes. Okay. So that's a big open question.
That's where I'm happy not to be commissioner, because this is not for me to make these decisions.
Yes. I always thought that quite a major feature of the CMA's new latest merger guidelines were, and I'm just mentioning this because you were talking about market definition, we're sort of moving the market definition chapter essentially from being the first chapter to the last chapter. So it's a real kind of downgrading of market definition to try to put far more emphasis on closeness of competition, things like diversion ratios and etc., rather than having a kind of market definition as your entry point to thinking about a merger. Do you see that issue as being in play, or?
Well, maybe I'm too traditional in there, but I mean, if you have closeness of competition, that suggests that you have a relevant market in which both parties that are arguably close are active. So for me, I think that's a distraction. In the end of the day, what matters is, are you, in most cases, dealing with sets of goods and services that are substitutable or not? In some other cases, maybe complementarity would become an issue, and whether you approach it through market definition, snip test, etc., you cannot always do that. Particularly in tech, very often you cannot. And therefore you have to revert to other means. Assessing closeness of competition can be one of them. So I don't really see here a mind-blowing, conceptual breakthrough.
You're not seeing a big need to downgrade market definition.
No, I don't see that.
Okay. Now, the part of the background to the mission letter and the revising of the guidelines, of course, is also the Draghi Report.
Yes.
And then major issues in Draghi, including the impact of competition policy on innovation and on investment, and on both of which you talked about earlier today, but also resilience, another concept. To what extent do you anticipate the new merger guidelines grappling with the role of merger policy in on any of those sort of topics that have clearly got much more prominence from Draghi?
Well, first, I think it's important to put Draghi in context, because rightly so, people always insist, as you just did, on what Draghi said should be, he didn't even say revised, but reviewed. But the first thing that Draghi says is that the basics of merger control in Europe are sound. The second thing he says is, in a modern market economy, there is no competitiveness without effective competition. And I would add that in a modern market economy, usually markets are oligopolistic, and there is no effective competition without a strong competition enforcement. So we're talking, as he said, evolution and not revolution. And then you're right, he picks several topics. The first one is innovation. And in innovation, I think the issue is not so much on the side of innovation theories of harm, in which Europe has been rather active, more than most jurisdictions in the world. I think the angle of Draghi is, and what about those mergers that bring about innovation that couldn't have existed absent the merger?
Yeah.
So how do you deal with innovation as an efficiency? And that is a good question. We do that already. We have decisions in which we did that, but I think it's fair to say that the analytical tools to do this are less developed on the side of the assessment of efficiencies. Also because consultancies like yours or academics didn't invest so much in it in the past. And to be fair, Probably they didn't invest so much in the past because the cases in which it was even argued by the parties are there's virtually none.
Yeah.
But okay, we will certainly review that and have a look at it. Investment is a bit more tricky because, I mean, there what Draghi says is there are a number of markets in which scale doesn't matter so much. But there's some markets in which scale matters because you need to commit. It's non-cycle. You have a break-even point that is very high, huge investment. So you need to have a minimal critical mass to be a player.
Yeah.
And that's true. So I'll be able to commit investments, in particular if you want to be on the side of innovation in this market. So there, the issue is how do you deal with an alleged efficiency, let's call it that way, short of a better term, flowing from the mergers is we will be able to commit these billions of investment we wouldn't be otherwise.
Yeah.
And how do you, if this is true, and if your assessment, if that should these billions of investment happen, that would tilt the balance of advantages or disadvantages of the merger the right way.
Yeah.
How do you ensure it's done? And what do you do if it's not?
Yeah.
So that one is quite tricky.
Yeah. And then one more trickiness, if I may, is the sort of risk of lapsing into an efficiency offense territory where I think the parties can be a little bit nervous about this.
Maybe, but even if you stay on the defense side, it will be tricky enough, I believe. So we will also have a look at this. Our track record, we have zero track record in mergers, never accepted this.
Yeah.
It's a bit, all things equal, what the CMA seems to have accepted in this telecom merger. It's purely behavioral, which in the case of the CMA is interesting. After all the statements we had about how bad and inadequate behavioral remedies could be. But okay, it will be part of the review certainly. But I expect that it will be a complicated debate. We will, and I'll come to in a second to the process. We will seek, of course, feedback from the markets, and consultancies for the full firms, etc. And then resiliency is even a different animal because part of the resiliency debate can be subsumed into an efficiency debate, but part cannot. I mean, all the geostrategic part.
Yeah.
It's not that it's invalid; it's extremely valid.
Yeah.
But it's about balancing a competition interest against another type of public interest.
Yeah.
And that is not the job, and we're not equipped as a competition authority to do that. So for part of the issue, you can have a discussion in the framework of efficiency, and mostly resiliency will be achieved through diversification.
Yeah.
This is the easy bit.
Yep.
Well, then the more competition, the more diversification, the better. In some cases, resiliency can run against efficiencies. Very simple example. We very often, the parties argue that part of the efficiencies, sometimes a big part of the efficiencies, is in streamlining the supply and the distribution chain.
Yeah.
That runs flatly against resilience.
Yeah.
So how do you assess that balance? That's quite a mystery for me. It's difficult to do in a competition framework anyway. So there, I think I expect a number of interesting debates.
No, I mean, resilient. I mean, if you're very reductive, it seems to me resilience sometimes might mean having one extra player, and sometimes it's having one fewer player. So
and sometimes it means re-onshoring, and sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah.
So it's difficult to have a kind of hypothetical, high-level discussion about this.
Okay, and I mean, just very quickly, and this is all fascinating, but very quickly the extent to which the new guidelines would be grappling with some of the topics we were just discussing, or does that have to somehow evolve outside of guidelines?
Well, I don't know is the answer. I mean, we try to do things seriously, so we are mandated to review the guidelines.
Yeah.
And normally we never, kind of predetermine the outcome. Because otherwise, why would you go through a month of public consultations, etc., if you know already what you want to do?
Yeah.
So we will consult, probably more than once. We'll consult the first time. We will impact assess. We will have a view at what worked less well in the past.
Yeah.
That will feed into our forward-looking impact assessment. And on that basis, taking into account all of these outputs, we will make choices internally in terms of what we pick, what we don't pick, and how we go forward. We craft that into a draft, and that draft will be published for consultation. That's the way we always do. We will have all sorts of reactions, right, left, and bottom.
Yeah.
And on that basis, we will produce a second draft, on which at least we will consult the member states, and then we will go for final approval. But to tell you what you will be in the finally approved text, I'm utterly unable to do at the moment.
Understood. Can I just shift gears slightly onto a kind of jurisdictional question? So I'm an economist. This isn't so much my area, but Illumina Grail is obviously something that is of great interest to legal community, to firms deciding where, if at all, that there will be jurisdiction over the review of their merger. Could you just give us a sense of how you see the outlook there in terms of closing any enforcement gap that may now have opened up?
Well, I think at least in Europe, in the community of enforcers, there is a clear common understanding that the court ruling opened an enforcement gap. Because it's not that they're numerous, but we have more than, say, 20 years ago, occurrences of cases in which the target is a very small firm, if measured by turnover, sometimes no turnover at all. But the detrimental potential of the merger, at least upfront before investigation, is large on a very wide territory that sometimes is the entire world. So mergers with these characteristics should be scrutinized. And they are actually scrutinized in the US, in which you can say, well, I want you, and I don't want you.
Yep.
They're scrutinized in the UK because they have a similar degree of flexibility. We have a system that is super predictable, say, based on threshold, etc. And therefore, this type of mergers created difficulty because you want to find a system that allows you to review them, without going into a huge thing in which you force thousands of companies to notify small deals that nobody cares about. So that's just about it. So how do you achieve that? We thought we had found the right solution by reinstating the original working of Article 22, which is predicted on the basis that member states, not competition authorities of the member states, but member states, when they think a merger, irrespective of whether they have competence or not, is problematic on their territory and potentially more, they can ask the Commission to review them. What the court said is basically, yes, that's true. The tribunal, who in first instance said we were right, is very right in his analysis, but small problem, with 35 years later, now member states, almost all of them have the merger control. So you need to be re-legitimated by the legislator. It's not so obvious that they still mean the same. And that is what creates the problem. You have basically two ways to address it, and there's not necessarily mutually exclusive. And both have drawbacks.
Yeah.
The first one is to rely on member states' capacity to attract, with their own Article 22-like ways of attracting in their jurisdiction individual cases. And once they have jurisdiction, they can refer it to us.
Yep.
This is what happened recently with NVIDIA Run AI. The issue here is, for the time being, we have 12 member states that have a capacity to do this. 5 or 6 are in the process of equipping themselves, and probably the rest will move as well at some point. So rather sooner than better, you will have at least 20 member states, I think, with this capacity. So, and you may say, well, then your problem is fixed. Except that these national regimes, they're all governed by different rules, different deadlines, different starting point. Is it when you know about the merger? Is it when it's notified? Is it when, I don't know. Also different substantive rules. Do you need to have a local nexus in your country? Take Illuminate Grail. I mean, a characteristic of these cases is there is no local nexus anywhere.
Yeah.
It's a problem. If it is a problem, it's a problem everywhere. So as soon as you have a local nexus requirement in the member states, you basically rule out a number of cases, even if they meet all of the other characteristics. So what I meant to say is that relying on member states may be fine, but it's not without drawbacks, and it's everything but a bright line. It will increase considerably the complexity for firms compared to the Article 22 system as we implemented it. The second obvious way to deal with it is to modify, potentially even very slightly, Article 22 to reassure the judges that this is still what the legislator means.
Right, yeah.
And then there are also drawbacks, otherwise it would not be fun. And that is that I think pretty much all the member states agree that there is an issue. Mm-hmm. They all agree that it be fixed. It's less clear whether they all agree it should be fixed in the same way. Mm-hmm. And it's very clear they all have all sorts of other different things they would like to put in the merger regulation.
Yeah.
And on this, they all disagree.
Okay, yeah.
And the merger reg can only be modified by unanimity.
Yeah.
So for me, either everybody's reasonable and says, okay, well, we have a big problem, but it requires a very small surgical change in the merger reg. Let's just do that and be reasonable. And the bigger debate we will have at another time. And then maybe it's a good solution, and that would happily complemented what the member states are doing. But if we're unable to have this assurance from the member states, nobody wants to reopen the Pandora box, discuss 10 years, and come to no conclusion.
And just very quickly, if I may, can DMA be a route to this, solving this problem in some cases?
No, because DMA doesn't include any merger provision, but for the obligation to inform the Commission about any acquisition for the gatekeepers. And of course, the court ruling on Article 22 emptied a bit of its meaning, this obligation, because now we know, but we cannot do anything with this information.
I see. Okay, so that's not a solution. Can I sort of take us into the last stage of this discussion with just widening out to the international perspective and then the implications for the health of competition in Europe. I mean, one feature of tech mergers is that very often we're talking about global mergers because it's sort of a single tech platform and it's active everywhere. And not only Europe is reviewing it, but other competition agencies around the world are reviewing it. If you then combine that with some of your earlier remarks about the fact that the assessment can be quite complex, there is obviously the scope for divergent outcomes, even if every agency is really focused on the competition question and trying to get the right answer to that question. But increasingly, we're entering into a world with more, it seems, sort of high stakes geopolitics, tariffs being threatened, and etc. So one can easily imagine situations where Europe is deciding on a tech merger where a European prohibition could amount to a global prohibition because there's no feasible local remedy, but where that very much upsets some other part of the world. What is your confidence, if you like, about institutional robustness to deal with that level of pressure on an agency trying to decide a merger on competition grounds?
Well, as I told you, we're predictable. We're predictable because our statutes are quite clear. Mm-hmm. And our margins not to do the job for any reason that is alien to the competition analysis is really limited. Mm. And I'm sure the judges would remind us that if ever we forgot it. So maybe to indirectly answer your question, let me tell you an anecdote. A very long time ago, actually 25 years ago, a bit more even, there was a case that was called Boeing McDonnell Douglas, mm-hmm. which I was dealing with in the private office of the Competition Commissioner at that time. And the US found no problem in that case. And we found pretty significant issue, mm-hmm. in particular because it was going along with exclusive contractual relationships that was basically reserved the US territory to Boeing post-merger. So we said we would prohibit, and finally we found an agreement with Boeing committed not to enter into this type of exclusive dealing agreements with US companies. The president of the United States was Bill Clinton, mm-hmm. and he called each and every head of states and government in Europe. And the decision went forward.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Very good. So we will wait for see what happens next.
No, but I mean, when you, as a company, when you active in a jurisdiction, for the better and the worse, you deal with the rules that are enforced in that jurisdiction.
Yeah. I mean, I only asked the question because there's a difference between, I suppose, political pressure being exerted and political pressure being exerted with, in companion with threats that may be very significant for the European economy, and then that is a higher level of stress testing on the system and its ability to withstand those kind of pressures.
Well, I'm really ill-placed to speculate on any of this. Let's see.
Yeah.
I think it's widely admitted, at least by economists, that anything that looks like a trade war or a protectionist withdrawal of the major economies would be bad for everybody.
Agree. Mm-hmm. Last question. The Draghi thesis, if I can go back to the sort of Draghi thesis, and given that we're talking about tech, is that the European economy really failed to participate to the extent, anything like to the extent of the US economy in the tech revolution, measured by the number of companies that have succeeded and et cetera, harming our competitiveness and our prosperity in Europe. We've talked about some ideas and reforms for the application of merger control in the tech space that may be more evolutionary rather than revolutionary. And I just wondered if you could end with a kind of forward-looking view about your view about the capacity of merger control, but maybe also the rest of competition policy to meaningfully change the level of tech success, if I can put it that way, of Europe, or the extent to which it really depends on all kinds of other policy pillars and cultural pillars. And these things in the end have to be all happening in sync to get meaningfully different outcomes.
Well, I fear I will disappoint you, but I think, and I'm on the record for a long time having said that publicly, that competition policy in general, merger control in particular, is not center stage in that debate.
Yeah.
It is not because of our competition policy that we do not have developed GAFAM-like companies. So, I mean, I have this question sometimes. Was your very tough competition policy, whatever, when large incumbents in the tech in Europe buy small startups? I say, well, who are these large incumbents? Who are the cases? They do not exist, and they do not exist not because of merger control. They do not exist for a variety of other reasons. They do not exist because it's not that we innovate less than the US. Actually, when you look at the metrics, we don't. It is because addressing the market is a problem. In the US, if you're a successful young tech company, you can at least address the whole of the US market upfront. In Europe, if you're a successful French tech, you address the French market. And then you need to take the necessary steps to address maybe Germany, Benelux, and gradually you will address. So your ability to scale up simply in terms of addressing a single market is not the same. We need to do better in that. Funding. And people say, oh yeah, but Europeans, you're risk averse. That's not true. Every year, 380 billion of EU saving is crossing the Atlantic to finance risk in the US.
Yeah.
And I just cannot believe that these people would not be more comfortable financing risk at home. If they don't do it, there is a reason. This reason has to do with the structure of capital markets in Europe. We need to fix that.
Yeah. Or it's linked to your previous point about just scale, the scope to scale up. Yeah.
Actually,
because these go together. Yeah.
Probably scale in financing.
Yeah.
And scale in the ability to distribute your product. So, and that is what is at the core of another just as interesting report, which is the LETA report, very complementary with Draghi. It says, we do not have a real functioning single market. And that is the most urgent thing to do. So, and I think that is true. The role of competition policy is to help constructing this single market. And historically, this is what we have been doing, is to combat the attempts by firms to enhance the market power by partitioning markets along national borders in Europe, et cetera, and to preserve the kind of competition in the innovation competitive process, so that it's not captured too early by big firms that have a market power and an interest to do that, to protect that position. So all things that we do, we always can do better, but I don't see a need to fundamentally, and this is what says Draghi basically, gives an inflection to merger policy to do that, because that's pretty much what we're trying to do already.
Olivier, thank you. We've covered I think a lot, far more perhaps than I expected. So I'm very grateful for you for sticking the course and giving us, as you did earlier today, so many insights. So thank you very much indeed.
For the pleasure, Neil. Thank you for the questions.
Thank you.
Thanks.
You listened to an episode of Antitrust Code by Concurrences. If you want to read more about this topic, check the Concurrences website, where you can find all relevant articles. Follow us on Twitter @CompetitionLaws and join the Concurrences group on LinkedIn to receive updates on our next podcast.